Hi, it's Dee from Glasgow Loves EU, and today I'm going to date stamp this 26th of October 2020, and we're absolutely delighted that we have Patrick Grady joining us this evening. I don't expect he needs too much introduction. He's represented Glasgow North down at Westminster since May 2015, so you're in that class of 2015, which must have been very interesting with lots of now well-known faces. And you've seen 3 parliaments and 3 prime ministers, I think. So
Yep.
maybe you have a word to do about that later on. And he's currently the chief whip of the SNP down at Westminster. And on my very random sample of 2 people in your constituency, you get a big thumbs up from them for being an excellent constituency MP and always being responsive to their needs and inquiries. So that's very nice. Okay, so we will get on to Brexit shortly, but I just want to kind of catch up with you and catch up where Westminster is, because back in the summer we talked to Kirsten Oswald and Alan Smith only a few weeks apart in sort of June, July, I think. But obviously things have changed quite a lot since then. So just to kind of see how it feels down there and how is it operating. And I've seen a couple of I saw a little discussion, I'd call it, that you had with Mr. Rees-Mogg about the ease or otherwise of every MP being able to participate right now. Can you only vote if you're there in person? I know you've mentioned that you do proxy votes, but other than proxy, and can you just say just a couple of words about how it feels at the moment?
Sure. Thanks. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me along. Obviously, I'm good pals with Glasgow Loves EU. I was looking back at some of the photographs of the street stalls and things, and the very non-socially distant gatherings we were having even as late as January, when nobody knew what was coming around the corner. And I'm sure we'll get onto some of the Brexit aspects later on. We're actually on a week of recess just now, which is why it's a bit easier to join the call. Normally we'd come back from a summer recess, have a couple of weeks, and then go into the party conference season, and that hasn't happened this year for all the reasons that we're familiar with. So we've had a stretch since coming back from summer, and we've got another stretch when we go back next week, probably right through until Christmas. And one of the reasons for that is because there's quite a backlog of parliamentary business, government legislation that needs to be, or that the government anyway wants to take through, and some of that is Brexit legislation, which again I'm sure we'll come on to later on. And the reason for that backlog is because Parliament, much like the rest of the country, was properly shut down at the end of March. We were going off for an Easter recess in any event, but that was brought forward a bit early, and it went on for an extra couple of weeks into early April, at which point we were brought back in virtual terms, and it meant that all of us from home were able to participate in parliamentary proceedings. We could take part in debates like this through Zoom, we could question ministers, and perhaps most importantly and relevantly, we could vote remotely. So my job as the whip, rather than pointing people which lobby to walk into, was texting and emailing the group at the opportune moment to make sure that they were casting their electronic votes properly. But rather disappointingly, and I think as a kind of sign of the UK government's attitude to a lot of things, they decided after about a month or so of this, when we got past the short break that we had in May, that members who wanted to take part in debates and who wanted to vote in person would have to attend Parliament in person. So there's now a bit of provision for question times to take place remotely. So members, including our leader, Ian Blackford, he dials into Prime Minister's questions from Sky. But if you want to take part in debates and legislation, like the Internal Market Bill that we had, you do have to be physically present. And the way that members who can't travel for reasons related to the pandemic, either because they're ill or the household is ill or they have childcare responsibilities that are more difficult with change provisions for schooling and so on, is that they can appoint a member to be a proxy for them in the division lobbies. And most members, they're not required to, but most members will appoint their party whip or one of their whips to do that. So for me, so in the SNP, that's been me. So I've been casting votes on behalf of anywhere between 21 and 35
Wow.
of my colleagues. So,
okay.
yeah.
That's useful to know. I was looking at some of the recent votes and looking at the beautiful bar charts they do of the eyes and the nose, and looking at the blocks of blue and then the multi-stripe blocks on the other side.
Yep.
And it struck me as being visually really depressing that all those amazing House of Lords amendments to things like the Agriculture Bill and Internal Markets Bill and all sorts of other bills just get thrown out. So we have this kind of dual system, but it doesn't seem to, with the majority that they have, and presumably the whipping processes that they have, how can it be overturned and without a general election? It kind of feels, what's the point almost? That's probably not a very good thing to say, but do you know what I mean? Sort of.
Well, to be fair, there have been there have been a small blue bars in those opposition
but not
columns from time to time on the agriculture, even on some of the immigration bill. And to be fair, sometimes those have had to be cast by the proxies. So the government deputy whip, Stuart Andrew, who casts most of the proxies for the Tories, has had to go through breaking his own whip by casting the proxy vote for the Tory rebels. So that's really what it means to be an honourable member, having to do that. And we haven't had the immigration, the internal market bill back from the Lords yet, but certainly the immigration, the agriculture bill, they go back. For those bills, we're in what's known as ping pong, and this is the power that the House of Lords has, and we can have a separate debate about appointment and elections to the House of Lords.
We'll forget that for tonight.
The power that the Lords has as a revising chamber is to delay and force the government to think, and it can make the government's life very difficult if it chooses to do that. And we are expecting, when we come back, a agriculture and immigration bill amendments that's going to insist, is the expression that they use, and I think that's on food standards and agriculture, and the Dubs amendment on immigration, and possibly one or two other things. And if there are significant, and especially even a small number of Tory rebels, that gives the Lords, if you like, a mandate to continue to insist and have this ping pong. And if that starts to get to a stalemate, then the government has to kind of compromise, because otherwise it won't get the bill through at all. It'll just be delayed, or it's got to wait. It's got to use these mechanisms under the Parliament Act, where it's got to wait a year, and it can't do that with Brexit legislation. So there is a possibility of forcing a certain amount of compromise. But there are limitations to that, as you say, and perhaps without getting too much into the detail of it, one of the limitations is because the Lords doesn't have an electoral mandate, it can't exercise a veto in the same way that the US, the Senate could in the United States, for example.
Okay, well, that's interesting. The other thing I was going to mention on the voting thing was the thing about English only votes, because you made, again, I saw something that you were talking about, and then there was this whole, because Douglas Ross was kind of squirming on the hook on any questions the other night, because he abstained on the Marcus Rashford free school meals one, and the rest of the Tories voted obviously against passing that, because it was presumably because it was a Labour motion. So I mean, and it must be difficult, because you made the point about the hospital. There was a hospital in Wales, sort of on the border between Wales and England, and so can the Welsh person vote if it's a hospital that's technically in England but Welsh people go to, and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, so the formal evil English votes for English laws.
Evil, formal, you kept saying evil, and I was thinking of evil. Is it evil?
Evil. Yes. English votes for English laws. This is David Cameron's great legacy as Prime Minister. On the day after the independence referendum, he stood on the steps of Downing Street and he said he would introduce a system of English votes for English laws, so that England's voice could be heard. And it's an incredibly convoluted and complicated system, and literally about half a dozen people, probably in the House of Commons, properly understand it, including the clerks, the speakers, and a few of us in the SNP who take an active interest in it. The specific vote you're referring to was on the the NHS funding bill that the government brought forward as this kind of statement that it was going to fund the NHS to a certain level. It doesn't need to do that. It was a completely pointless piece of legislation. But because the NHS has devolved, we were actively excluded as members from Scotland from participating in certain stages of the bill. And we objected to that, because in the SNP we have always exercised for 50 or more years of parliamentary representation. We've always exercised a sort of self-denying ordinance that we don't generally vote on matters that only affect England and Wales, or that don't directly affect Scotland, or nowadays that are devolved to Scotland. But the point we've always made is that it's for us to decide that. It shouldn't be for the standing orders of the House of Commons, or for the Speaker of the House of Commons, who actually has to certify these bills as being in England only. It shouldn't be for someone else to decide. It should be for us to decide whether or not something is relevant to our constituents. And that's why, for example, on Wednesday, we did vote on the free school meals motion, because if the UK government releases additional funding to support free school meals in the English regions and Wales, then Scotland will get Barnett consequentials out of that. So it is in our interests to support that kind of motion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Just one more tiny topic before we get on to Brexit, and this is something else that sorry, I've been looking at all your speeches in Parliament, so and it's a topic that's very close to my heart as well, which is UBI, Universal Basic Income, and it's kind of struck me throughout this whole pandemic business with the whole palaver of, the furlough, the job support and the percentages, and the millions of people that have fallen through the net with nothing. And then also keep mentioning the free school meals, because that is a big issue. And, it'd be interesting if that is an overturned vote, because there's talk about that today. But UBI seems to me to be an interesting concept to at least explore, because but my theory is, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, is that one of the reasons they don't want to even think about it is because they'd have to have a proper grown-up conversation about tax, because obviously the people who don't need it, if it's universal, they'd get it, but you'd need to then claw it back from them in the tax system. Yes,
I think that's in short order correct. I think that's a pretty good analysis of the situation. Just interestingly, on the free school meals, you're right, the government may compromise, the Tory government may compromise on that. And that's why, going back to your earlier question about the lack of rebels, sometimes the threat of rebellion is actually enough. So the governments don't have, the members don't always, the government isn't always good, because it doesn't want to lose votes. So it will sometimes compromise before the effect of it losing a vote. And hopefully maybe we'll see some of that on some of these points.
Yes, although he is.
But back on to UBI, I mean, the point I've made several times, as have many of my colleagues, is the pandemic is having a major cost to society, to the economy, and the government, the state, is going to have to pay for that one way or the other. So it can either pay for it through job support schemes, through income guarantees, or it's going to pay for it through universal credit, through the long-term costs of mass unemployment, all the impacts that has for the longer term on the health service, for housing, for the police, all the rest of it, just like we saw in the 1980s with mass unemployment and mass restructuring of the economy. So the government has to meet the costs, and it seems to me that it makes more sense for it to do that in a positive way that protects jobs and protects livelihoods. And an extension of a universal basic income is the sort of logical conclusion of that train of thought, because you have employees, people who are worried about their jobs, you have employers, people who run businesses. Small businesses are a huge part of my constituency in Glasgow North. You have this huge chunk of self-employed, the excluded, 3 million people who've not had any support through furlough or job retention schemes or any of that throughout the lockdown. But a universal baseline income would support everybody and give everybody a level of comfort that would allow them to survive through an economy. And you're right, absolutely, those of us that are in a fortunate position to not need that as a result of our income, that it would be paid back through the taxation system. And we have a system, we have a national insurance system. It's not proper insurance because the money gets paid in and spent at the same time. But we all have NI numbers. We have a mechanism for collecting and distributing money that not all countries do in the same way that ours is set up. So there is an opportunity there. And as my colleague Ronnie Cowan, who's a real champion of this, and I had a debate recently in Westminster Hall about it, said to the minister, he says, well, prove us wrong. Set up some trials. The Scottish Government wants to set up trials here in parts of Glasgow and elsewhere. Set up some trial schemes and prove to us that it doesn't work, So I think the pandemic is helping to force some of these discussions and concepts and put them further up the agenda than they might have otherwise been. So you'll have heard Rishi Sunak in his response to the other day just ruling it out of hand. But there's space for that debate that didn't previously exist.
Good. That's very encouraging. So let's get on to Brexit, which is our bread and butter on this channel. So the first thing is, obviously, good old Michel. He's still here. He stayed over the weekend. I was wondering where he was staying. I just said, he's staying till Wednesday. Deal or no deal? What's your current view on where they are getting it? Is it likely?
Schrodinger's.
Go on.
Yeah, Schrodinger's Brexit. Schrodinger's deal. Is it alive? Is it dead? Is it coming? Is it going? I mean, right now, and I might not have said this 2 weeks ago, and I might not say it in 2 weeks' time, the mood music seems to be that some sort of deal will be possible. It's in everyone's interests to have a deal, even if it is a bad deal. I think Theresa May always used to say no deal is better than a bad deal. I suspect the view now is that a bad deal is better than no deal. Any deal is now going to seem like some sort of triumph, even if in fact it's not going to give us any of the kind of securities that those of us that didn't want Brexit in the first place might be looking for or be reassured by. But if the alternative is Kent turning into a car park, I think they'll need to find something to prevent that from happening, or at least to minimise it.
So where did they get this concept of the Australian deal from, which obviously is just the weasel words for no deal? I mean,
yeah, I think it's just marketing. I think it's just and then Michael Gove was dismissing Pete Wishart out of hand for suggesting, someone said you could call it a Mongolian deal because, just pick any country that has no trading agreement. Yes, exactly. With the European Union, but Australia sounds, something you can conceptualize a bit more easily, perhaps. It's bright and sunny, and sounds like it must be okay. But yes, in reality, there's no meaningful written down trade agreement between Australia and the European Union. So that's what Australian terms would be, WTO terms.
Well, I'm going to ask you again to get your crystal ball out. How do you see the relations between the UK and the EU evolving after the transition period? So once we get to January the 1st and onwards, what do you think it's going to be like? How are we going to?
Yeah,
it's an impossible question, really.
Some of that will depend on the nature of whatever kind of deal is arranged by the end of the year. Whether there's, what the review mechanisms for that are, whether they go straight from agreeing one deal into negotiations for a different kind of future relationship. It will depend on the terms that it's been agreed in. It will depend on the political leadership, both in the EU and at a UK level. I can imagine at an EU level, they'll be like, right, well, it's done. Cheerio, so long and thanks for all the fish, as Douglas Adams once said.
Always love a literary reference.
Yes,
on these
there you go. And they might, and the EU has enough to be getting on with in terms of its own internal, regulation and reform. In terms of all the challenges that you might face: immigration, climate, trading relationships with the rest of the world, all these issues that the EU wants to focus on internally within itself, within its own structures, and it'll have a relationship with the EU and with the UK, and why the UK should expect any kind of special relationship is kind of beyond me. I think the current government anyway, the whole point from their point of view of Brexit was to have this new relationship with elsewhere in the world, global Britain, as they like to say. So perhaps their diplomatic focus will be on building a relationship with the United States, whoever happens to be in charge, or trying to reinvigorate the Commonwealth, or whatever it might be. But whether anyone in the world stage is actually interested in all of that, because, from our point of view, membership of the European Union was such an important part. That enhances your international status, and leaving and being very isolated. I think I think it might be a bit of a wake-up call. I think some of the Conservatives, especially the Brexiteers more generally, who thought that this was going to be Empire 2.0, are going to find that that's not the case at all.
Well, yeah, so, I mean, I kind of feel that we've been sort of saying all these things for such a long time, and there's other people who don't seem to believe it. Our biggest, our most popular Facebook post recently is the one about people suddenly realizing that they might have to wait an hour to not be able to go through the automatic gates. Why are they surprised about that? Anyway,
some of us were saying this. Some of us were saying this 18 months ago and more.
Oh, more. I mean, I can remember thinking about those things before when the
before the referendum happened.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep. Jenny, I think we might have a question or two to bring up.
Yeah, two questions. Well, one is from Bill Roger, who's just saying, back to the House of Lords discussion.
Okay.
Do you regret that the SNP doesn't have any representation in there? I suppose I would add to that, is that a sort of, how's that come about? And sure. Also just on this trading arrangement and things, how many of your constituents have come to you with like issues, like sort of serious issues? If you work in services, that looks like it's going to be really tricky. Have you actually had practical issues like that?
Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, so at the top of Maryhill Road, just close to the boundary, is the West of Scotland Science Park, and there are multi-million-pound businesses, absolutely cutting edge, laser technology, bio, oh God, what do they call themselves? Biorepository trading, all kinds of really innovative, first-class organization companies, and just at their wits' end with some of the prospects of Brexit, and especially a no-deal Brexit. I've got the University of Glasgow as well, so huge numbers of European national staff, who now face all the challenges of immigration, regularising their status, free movement, all of that kind of stuff. So I hear it on a day in and day out basis from my constituents, and I'm very happy to take up as many individual cases as I can to try to get certainty and clarity for people, and it's all frankly just a kind of fuel to the fire of the broader points and arguments that we're making. But Glasgow is a European city. It's, you can tell that just by walking around the street and listening to the conversations that people are having. I think Glasgow will still be a European city, whether or not we're in the European Union. We've technically left, but after the new year. On the House of Lords, so the SNP's never taken seats in the House of Lords because we fundamentally disagree with the appointment system. And of course, remember, until Blair was in charge, the majority of peers were life peers. They were hereditary. So we absolutely disagreed with that. And you still have a proportion of life peers. You also have, with the greatest of respect to the Church of England bishops, usually if I'm giving people a tour of the building, which we've not done for months, point out the only other legislature in the world that has religious clerics in it as of right is Iran. You know, the only other, the House of Lords is second only to the People's Assembly of the Republic of China in terms of its size. You know, these kind of anomalies and things can go on and on. So over the years, I think once a party gets electoral representation in the House of Commons, it is usually offered through whatever mechanisms exist in the British state to make these things happen. It is usually offered seats in the House of Lords. So you've seen the Green Party in recent years take seats. Plaid Cymru, even UKIP, I think, has one or two peers. But the Scottish National Party has never accepted seats in the House of Lords. There was famously a big debate back in 2005 at party conference, which was actually a motion. In fact, I was one of the people that brought it forward to reaffirm that position. It wasn't to change the position, it was to reaffirm it, but it took on the air of a debate of whether or not now was a time to change the policy, and the conference rejected it quite overwhelmingly. Excuse me, I don't see that changing. To be fair to the Green Party, what they do is they have an internal election, so their membership vote on who they should nominate, and given they've not been as successful in winning for first past the post seats, it gives them a little bit more of a voice in the legislature. But I don't see it ever happening. I suppose it's not impossible that a member of the House of Lords, because the rule is that no member of the SNP shall join the House of Lords. I suppose it's not impossible that someone could join the House of Lords and then ask to join the SNP. But I think that would be kind of
bit disingenuous, maybe.
Yes, a bit disingenuous. So I don't see that changing. To be honest, there was one other thing I was going to say related to that, but I don't see that changing, and I don't think there's very much to. I don't think there's much to be gained. To be honest, I am one of the few people in the Scottish National Party, though, who has sat on the red benches of the House of Lords because there was an exercise, a contingency exercise, and if the roof fell in or the House of Commons sprung a leak or God help us, something worse, then actually there are provisions to decant the Commons into the Lords, which is what happened during the war when the chamber of the House of Commons was bombed, and the House of Commons would meet in the Lords chamber. So there was a contingency exercise, and I went along in my capacity as the chief whip just to get a sense of what it was all about. And so I was sitting on the front bench of the House of Lords, and I don't think many people from the SNP have done that.
But no ermine.
No ermine.
Okay, let's get back to Brexit. And you mentioned America, and I was going to sort of bring up the US election, because there's kind of interesting opinion pieces at the moment as to whether Johnson is kind of hanging on the result of the American election as to decide whether to absolutely go one way or another, because even to his head, he must have got the message that Biden is no fan of his, and certainly no fan of the Internal Markets Bill, because of the impact on the island of Ireland, which he has strong connections to. Any thoughts on that area?
Yeah, well, I noticed Downing Street was fervently denying these claims that they're waiting to see. Well, exactly. The US says jump and the Downing Street says how high.
Yeah.
But it sort of gives lie to this notion of Britain is great, global Britain, that we're going to be this free bestriding the world stage kind of thing. If we're dependent on the outcome of somebody else's election, not even in the European Union, not let's wait for the elections in Germany or France to happen so that we can negotiate with the new government that's come in. No, let's wait and see what happens in the United States before we decide what our relationship with Europe is going to be. And in any event, whether it's Trump or Biden, that's only 4 years of Trump, 4 years of Biden, whether he runs for a second term or not. The European, well, indeed, the European election, the European relationship is supposed to be not forever, but for a long time, a new permanent relationship. So it sort of gives lie, but then maybe, just suggests that there was never really a plan in the first place. You know, right from the off. You know, way back to Cameron deliberately instructing the civil service not to plan for a leave outcome. So when that result came through in June 2016, they didn't know what to do. They didn't have a plan, you know, and we're living with the consequences of that to this day.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Oh, sorry, I've lost you there.
Okay.
Right. Right. Okay. Let's move on to the. Oh yes, yeah. The other issue that we need to talk about, which is obviously the position of Scotland with regard to you know, our potential future situation with regard to the EU and the potential routes to get there. We are. I should have said at the beginning. We usually say at the beginning, but you know, because you know us. We are a cross-party group, and we have members of all parties and none, and supporters and non-supporters of the independent route, and so therefore we're not sort of like flying a flag for that particularly, but we can't ignore it. We can't ignore the fact that I think back in the spring it was the polls were at about 52%, and they've gone up to about 58% now, and that's largely from the analysis I've heard from John Curtis and others, because of people who hate Brexit, who really want to stay in the EU and are seeing that is a potential, possibly the only potential route for Scotland to get back into some sort of relationship with the EU. So do you have any thoughts on that, and whether or not if we get to that point, we should be looking for full membership of the EU, or going via the EEA or EFTA routes as perhaps stepping stones?
Yeah. So you know, it's interesting because sometimes people say to us in the SNP, oh, well, you don't really want to be independent because you'll be in the European Union and you'll be giving up sovereignty, and it's not really independence. But actually, you know, you think about the conversation we've just had about what the UK's status is going to be in the world geopolitically, global politics, global diplomacy, diplomatic terms. What is it going to be, this small island state in the North Atlantic? What I often say to people is that actually your independence these days is defined by your interdependence. How do you know a country is independent? Well, because it's a member of the European Union, because it's a member of the United Nations, because it's a member of the WTO, because it belongs to NATO or one of the other treaty organizations, because it can freely choose to sign up to its membership of those different organizations and play a part as an equal, or at least on an equal footing, in the decisions of those organizations. And the route now for Scotland, if it wants to, you know, fulfill a role as a European state, as a member of any of these European bodies, whether it's the EEA or full membership of the EU, certainly in my view as an SNP member, is that it will have to be through independence. And you know, we argued post the referendum in 2016, post the Brexit referendum, that we should stay in the single market, that we should stay in the customs union. That would give us access to many of the benefits of the economic union without what Brexiteers saw as the disbenefits of the political union. That would have been a solution. That we argued for that right the way through the passage of legislation in the House of Commons throughout that, you know, tumultuous couple of years between 17 and 19. All of that fell on deaf ears, and we're now facing the hardest of hard Brexits, which was not, in as much as any coherent proposition was put forward in 2016, was not being promoted by any of the mainstream organisations. So, you know, it's right then that Scotland ought to be able to revisit the decision that it made in 2014, when being part of a United Kingdom that was a permanent long-term member, whose membership of the EU was not in question at that point in 2014. Our case very clearly is that it's right that we should have the opportunity to revisit that decision, and that the timing of that decision should rest with the elected representatives in the Scottish Parliament, not at the behest of Westminster. Now, Exactly, and it will very clearly, I think, it is the position of the Scottish National Party that an independent Scotland should rejoin the European Union. Now, in terms of what the timescale and method of all of that should be, I think will partly depend. It's very difficult to say right now when the UK's final relationship with the European Union hasn't been established, because that will inevitably be the starting point of what a relationship would look like. Because we expected in 2014 that Scotland would inherit all the obligations that the UK had in 2014. So that would include membership of all the organisations it was a member, all the treaty obligations it had. That would include its treaty obligations to the European Union at that point. It would include all the all the other commitments and positions that were there. So that would be the starting point in the context of a positive vote for independence for Scotland, as we would start with where we were in terms of our relationship with the UK, and seek to take it from there. But I think it's very clear that there's much more openness now, at least much more public openness now, to a route for Scotland as an independent country to rejoin the European Union than there necessarily was in the lead up to the 2014 referendum. So I think we'd be starting with a lot of goodwill on the European Union side if we wanted to rejoin.
Excellent. That's quite encouraging, I guess, for us, because I think that, you know, it's going to be a long time before England turns around and starts thinking positively about even single market and customs union again, even though I think that probably if they repolled England, the people of England, that an awful lot of them would be more keen on it now than they were in 2016. But hey, that's just me. Okay, another little question, Jenny, have we got?
Just some comments again about independence. The timescales,
Sure.
I think you mentioned. What would be the major milestones that you'd see on that? And somebody just talking about the move back from London. I guess if you got more powers back to Holyrood or whatever it's called, would I mean, who would have to shift? Would you shift people back, or would you wait and move when you got full independence, I suppose?
Well, so you know, my colleague Neil Gray is putting himself forward to be the candidate in Airdrie and Shotts at this forthcoming Holyrood election, and we've had a bit of moving backwards and forwards in both directions in all parties since the establishment of devolution. I think in 2014, the proposition was that the Scottish Parliament that was sort of extant would continue, and then there was due to be fresh elections anyway, not long after the proposed timetable for independence, that would formally happen sort of towards the end of March of 2016, I think was the timetable. Yes, and then the Scottish Parliament elections would have been in the May of that year. So that was the proposition that was in the white paper in 2014. I think in terms of timetables and so on, I think a big part of the point it goes back to what I was saying earlier about being ready and being prepared, and whether people agree with it or not. There was a blueprint in the white paper. I'm getting all my different colours here, but there was a plan for what the Scottish Government in 2014 wanted to do. So if there had been a yes vote, there was a plan of action that would have moved forward for what negotiations would have looked like. You know, our end point had been written out. We might not have got, you know, who knows exactly what the actual final arrangements would have looked like, but there was a roadmap there in the shape of the white paper. That was, you know, obviously not enough people agreed with it, but nevertheless there it was. There was no equivalent for the Brexit referendum, and that's why we've had this chaos, this uncertainty, because there's been no coherent vision of what they want to achieve. And again, we said in 2016 there was no need to rush it. Remember, Cameron had said he was going to trigger Article 50 immediately, and then instead just resigned, and off he went. They could have set up a royal commission. They could have put together a cross-party working group. Like after 2014, there was the Smith Commission, which was put together from all parties to come up with a proposal for further devolution, and that led to a Scotland Act and more powers for the Scottish Parliament. There was no such equivalent, no attempt to do likewise for Brexit. So to bring it back to the point of independence, I think you will see in the event of a yes vote and in the lead up to a second referendum, much more coherence. I think I'm not in a position to sit here right now and say exactly what the timescales should be, but you're still looking at Brexit, whether we like it or not, and it's a mess and it's chaotic and all the rest of it. We're still looking at that taking place within 4 years of the within the life, what would have been the lifetime of a parliament, except for the 2 elections that we've had, but within about 4 or 4.5 years of the vote to leave. The timetable in the 2014 white paper was about 2.5 years. So it depends on preparedness and goodwill on both sides. And the EU has wanted to cooperate with the UK, and it's been the UK time after time after time that has not been prepared. And I think going into a process that leads Scotland to be independent, we will be much more prepared, not least because in the SNP, we've actually been campaigning for this since 1934 and beyond, and you can dig out documents from the 1970s that have a draft constitution for an independent Scotland and so on, and they might not be 100% relevant today, but there's a willingness there to try to make it work.
It's quite interesting that predates any concept of the EU, really, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, I get really mad. I get every time you get like Slithy Toad, as I call him, saying, "Oh, it's all the EU. They're being horrible to us, and they're not doing this." I feel like shouting at the TV. Anyway, let's just round up. I'm just going to mention one slightly, completely different topic, really. But Glasgow is still, as far as we know, due to be the place that COP26 is going to happen.
Sure. Yeah.
As long as that doesn't get changed,
delayed again.
Of course it could do. And I'm kind of relating this to the engagement of young people, because one of the things we've always kind of, I wouldn't say struggled with, because we're very happy as our little group, but we've never had huge numbers of youngsters kind of wanting to join in the Brexit thing. Although, having said that, you go on all the marches that we've been on, they're full of people of all ages and from tiny ones onwards. But the youngsters are very, very engaged with the environmental issues, and so and things like Black Lives Matter, they seem to be more ignited by those matters. And so is there we've been thinking about how, because obviously that's in a year's time, and we'll have been, what is our function going to be in January? That's a rhetorical question. But we should move more towards because things like the environment, you can't deal with it on your own. You can't deal with an environmental crisis as global Britain. We can't do it. We've got to do it in conjunction with other people and other countries. So just any kind of final thoughts on that, and also throw this in as well, because I know that you've worked in Malawi, I think it was, in Africa. The kind of the internationalism and how we can kind of embrace some of those things, and how best to focus our activities and things in the future.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I hope the COP does go ahead in some shape or form. The UN General Assembly went ahead this year, all virtual. These negotiations have been taking place in a kind of blended format of virtual and a physical participation. So let's hope that the COP isn't further delayed, even if it's not quite the full-on descent into the city, which actually, from an environmental point of view, probably wouldn't necessarily be such a bad thing. There was always an irony of all these people flying in their private jets and chartered government air force flights, to talk about how we tackle climate change and the climate emergency. So let's hope it does go ahead, and it has been motivating. The climate crisis has been motivating the younger generation in an incredibly inspiring way, actually. And thinking back to the general election that we were coming up to this time last year, it was a major issue, and it was a particularly important issue among the new and younger and first time voters. In terms of getting them involved, I think actually it's quite interesting. You mentioned my background in international development, and I worked for a few international development charities and so on, who would have been traditionally the places that people would have looked to for leadership on a lot of these kind of campaigning issues, and would have been part of, if you think back to Make Poverty History, to the Trade Justice Movement, to the Jubilee Debt Campaign, the marches that took place around there. And what we're seeing now is, with the rise of social media, and a much more I don't know what the right word is, but a much more sort of spontaneous or organic grassroots mobilisation on a lot of these issues. So a lot of the climate strike, that wasn't organised by Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace or any, or Ski-Af or Oxfam or Christian Aid or any of these other organisations. That was just kids, inspired by Greta Thunberg, and then the organisations came in behind all of that, absolutely. And you've got Extinction Rebellion, who are a kind of offshoot of that as well. But a lot of it has manifested itself in a different way, and I think that's a factor of the different ways in which people can communicate and motivate each other these days. So I suppose, I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question here, but I think the trick is not to try to do something artificially.
Okay.
I mean, I used to go along to SNP meetings when I was much younger than I am now, and be one of the youngest people in the room, and it would be largely full of people older than me going, "Oh, how do we get the young people involved?" But the young people would just, we would do, speaking as a former young person,
You're still young compared to
we
us.
We mobilised and organised, not when I look at the generations coming forward now, so I suppose what I'm saying is there's a jigsaw, there's a kind of, there's space for all these different kind of campaigns, and you look at the event that you had at the top of the steps, and all over Scotland, just spontaneously on that day, on the 31st of January, to say "Leave a Light On," and that was spontaneous. It wasn't forced, and I think. And even now, this, people were asking about emails that come in from constituents, this groundswell that these red wall Tories are finding on the free school meals issues, that because people can be active without being prompted in the way that was perhaps necessary 10, 15, 20 years ago. I think if there's a strong message out there, you're always going to be part of a bigger movement, basically.
Well, that's great. That sounds like a very sort of positive way forward. There will be life for us beyond January the 1st. We are not going anywhere. Yes. Don't know what we'll be saying, but we'll be saying something. And so it remains for me to just thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely a pleasure chatting to you this evening, and thank you very much, and good luck as you continue to whip your MPs when you get back to Westminster, and try and get a bit of time off this week, because you obviously deserve it. Okay, thanks very much, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.